Having studied the journals of Ergen Delamere, which are contained in Moonsmoth Museum, I find myself more interested in obscure German urban legends. By these accounts, there was held to be, in certain maps of old, a city near Bavaria, some few miles north of the Black Forest. Writing in the year 1850, H. Delamere was born in Hamburg to an estranged mother and secretive father. Moreover, his recorded annals indicate his preoccupation with looking into his ancestral lineage around this time. Throughout this exhaustive process, of which I will only include the relevant pieces from his commonplace books, Mr. Delamere displays a clear certainty that he himself had visited this town known as Aufklärung as a boy. He would later allege to have returned to the town as an adult, describing it as a luxurious town, brimming with nature, with architectural featuring that has all the beauty of a romantic postcard. An iconic wooden bell tower stands on a little hill among many oak trees, which leads into the main line of shops, behind which rows upon rows of reddish-brown clinker houses are surrounded by an encircling dark forest. Most unusually, things one normally expects to find in a Confederate town. One doesn't. There is no church, nor town hall, and the strange dark quarter-houses a lot of underground shelters, where men do things in absolute privacy and secrecy. The truth of this account is, of course, a sure improbability, given that a modern surveillance of the region has shown no evidence of such a place ever having existed. Nonetheless, in Harrigan's journal, he writes about the ignition of his interest in the place, after stumbling upon documents written by his grandfather, an Egyptian Freemason. These documents indicated that the Delamere family had, in fact, lived in Aufklärung for several generations. In Harrigan's own words, he describes, furiously visiting every library in Berlin and Paris, seeking travelogues and old records, all of which seemed to confer the existence of the bush-encircled town north of the Black Forest. The first few books of Harrigan's journals are focused heavily on his detailed research. I wouldn't burden the reader by including too much of that fastidious research. That Ergen's father, an alcoholic, who rarely spoke to the young Delamere anything regarding his estranged mother, nor of the Delamere family's mysterious past, subsequently died in 1844, leaving a fair inheritance. This appears true. More than this, young Harrigan was then, for the first time, gifted among his father's belongings, detailed accounts of the lives of his ancestors. Whether these records are a hoax or falsified somehow, this remains to be proven or disproven. The genealogy of the Delamere clan, according to these old yellow scrolls, was inherently intriguing, dating back to certain nobility, not least of all the notorious Count of Brackenball, a distant relation to the Duke of Stuttgart. Inheriting an estate somewhere north of the Black Forest in 1111, the House of Brackenball was carried on for several generations, being passed to many young knaves, one daughter who would marry the foreign-born, Albert Delamere. From Harrigan's own notes, the Delameres kept a strong presence in the region. As Lothar became king of the Germans around 1123, and the disastrous expedition to Bohemia, and the Battle of Kulm occurred, many refugees flocked to the fertile plains of Bavaria and became serfs, building up a thorough community. Ergen provides copies of the detailed family trees in his commonplace book. Primarily of interest, I suppose, is the slow shift of power of the Delamere family. Raudeth Delamere married Sophia of Krastberg in 1213, giving birth in succession to Otto Delamere, Count Siegfried Delamere, the first bishop of Aufklärung, Heinrich Delamere. Canon of the Black Forest, Count Dietrich Delamere. These lineages go on for some many pages, but the most radical shift in the familial inheritance happened in 1540 as the Protestant Reformation swept through the region. A disgraced Bishop August Delamere seems to have abandoned many of the family estates in shame. What follows are a poorer and much more cunning series of generations who remain fundamentally embittered and seeking vengeance for their lost wealth. Ergen notes that the Delamere generations utterly abandoned their familial religion here, becoming somewhat fascinated with alchemy and the occult. Several of these reclusive characters spent many decades amassing great volumes of proclaimed magic texts, from Solomon's Key to the auspicious Lontars of the Vultures et al. Whilst the success or lack thereof remains unknown, the Delamere family spent great effort in attempts to recreate the Philosopher's Stone with various controversial chemical experiments. The only child, Valden Delamere, was supposedly an extensive traveler, having made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land to visit the apparent site of Solomon's Temple and supposedly having some relationship with the Order of the Knights of Malta. Valden passed on his own tales of having personally seen the Holy Grail and the Spear of Destiny that pierced Christ's side in a locked chamber somewhere. Even a magic book of spells that could bring the dead back to life. However, these exotic fancies were mostly brushed off by the following generations of Delamere as the delusions of an old braggart. At last, we come to Martin Delamere, Ergin's grandfather, who was born in 1769, becoming an active Freemason at the age of 25. Inspired by Renaissance genius, Leonardo da Vinci, my grandfather Martin, could be seen as ahead of his time in Germany. Whilst he kept all of his inventions a secret from the suspicious townsfolk, who saw him as at best a mad scientist, and worse, a sorcerer, and the adept of Satan. Among his various inventions, Martin passed on, in my father's possession, a strange device which he himself had called an Alchyscope. Made of gold and adorned with intricate designs, the device somewhat resembled a telescope in its overall structure, but with a larger, more machine-like compartment or engine. Ergin's experience with the Alchyscope becomes more of the subject of his journals later. The town of Aufklärung, meanwhile, became a bastion for certain men of letters and seemed to be a rapidly developing hub of Enlightenment ideas. The first major hospital was built in 1755, and many great period works of architecture line the curious streets. It is written that some of the nobles of Aufklärung saw danger in Renaissance thinking and outlawed these revolutionary ideas. French troops marched on Aufklärung in 1809, but were subsequently robbed of all power after the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, though the town retained a substantial French population. All this, at least, according to Ergen Delamere's own research. Ergen traces his family lineage back to Aufklärung. With the fall of the Holy Roman Empire and Napoleon in exile, being that the majority of the Marquis children abandoned Castle Eco-Shot after the Marquis was infamously butchered and burnt alive for the crimes of witchcraft. His orphan children were taken in by a friendly peasant family by the name of Bauer, residents of the quaint Bavarian town. That the Bauer family was known to show refuge for those persecuted by religious fundamentalism is perhaps no better displayed than through Reginald Bauer's large cellar, which had sheltered many in exile from Adam Weishaupt's banned Illuminati, among others fleeing the backlash to their Enlightenment ideas. It would seem that the young children, Sophie and Adam Delamere, picked up many of the traveling scientific and Renaissance passion for art, which they in turn passed on to their own children. For, though the Delameres were known in Aufklärung as a secretive sect, harboring illegal ideas, when I was to return there in 1849, I was to find my Aunt Gladys and cousin Raphael to be quite personable, albeit marvelously eccentric thinkers who carried on the pursuits and interests of their ancestors, though perhaps in more humble means. Of Ergen's epic return journey to his hometown and the subsequent story he tells of using the Alchyscope, I shall save for after these final pieces of his research, which I have deemed relevant. As a congregations of monarchs and statesmen gathered in Vienna, including Russian Tsar Alexander II, British Foreign Minister Viscount Castlereagh, Prussian Chancellor Fürst von Hardenberg, and a French representative named Talleyrand to discuss the restructuring of Europe, a burning sense of betrayal and desire for vengeance still festered in the hearts of the Delamere children. My once-removed relatives Raphael and Gladys would speak to me passionately of their opinion on their feelings about Prussia annexing the Rhineland and Aufklärung becoming part of the German Confederation. They spoke of Aufklärung as a very private town, which had no need to be burdened by the affairs of corrupt world powers, though they seemed to strongly agree with the ideals of the revolutions happening in Germany. Many of the townsfolk had apparently already held protests regarding the German customs union and the unification of states. Of course, I asked them if they didn't benefit from trade from other regions in Germany, a subject which they became very close-lipped about. Something did seem to occur in the town around 1820, for where the local nobility had seemingly managed to suppress Enlightenment ideas for decades. Gladys told me that September of 1819 had changed everything. Whilst Prussia introduced strict censorship on newspapers, magazines, books, and started banning fraternities in university, which encouraged illumination, the residents of Aufklärung had had enough. Whilst she never outright spoke of anything, in the vein of the French monarchist executions, the way she spoke about the 20s were as if the noblemen and wealthy rulers of Aufklärung had simply disappeared or ceased to exist. When Wilhelm IV, the Prussian king, was supposed to become emperor, the people of Aufklärung vowed that they would never have a king nor an emperor. Of course, I had to ask them, who runs the town now? But of this, I couldn't get a satisfactory answer. Having that awkward introduction out of the way, it now seems a suitable time to include the story of Hergen's return to his hometown, exactly as he describes it in his journal. It was the cold autumn months, late last year, when I decided to extend my research into a physical capacity. Certain experiments with Grossvater Martin's Alchyscope hadn't led to any solid conclusion. I managed to work out how to start the engine, at which point the device functions as a non-magnifying telescope. You look through the glass front eyepiece, focus through an aperture, and certain controls on the mount bring the clarity of the image to fruition. However, I was quite certain the device had another function, which I was yet to fully comprehend. Some small experimentation with the device outside, I had found certain buttons which triggered louder processes within the engine. However, the only change in what is seen through the Alchyscope I had yet to see was a kind of swiftly moving shadow. When I returned to look without the lens, the shadow had all but dissipated. This renewed my interest in the instructions and old maps, which had been in the same box as Martin's machine. I found therein a marked map, which had a route marked out on the east bank of the Rhine, somewhere above Stuttgart. Attached to this was a diagram of the Alchyscope, with certain outlined procedures. My only conclusion could be that Grossvater's Alchyscope was intended to be used in the region that it was created. So, packing a few weeks belonging into a range of suitcases, I resolved to take a trek out to the coordinates of latitude and longitude indicated in Herr Martin's maps. The horse and cart ride through the mountains was scenic, but long, and I experienced some degree of travel sickness. My driver did not speak German, and so the drive was rather solitary and melancholic. At least, he knew to stop every few hours, so I could smoke my pipe. The smoking herbs east of the Rhine were truly splendorous. There was an ominous gray sky that day, and the wind howled oddly. I was struck by the ear-chilling hoots of an unknown genus of tawny owl. These sometimes had a musical quality, as though the creatures were communicating with one another. When at last we reached the coordinates mentioned by my grandfather, I was rather awestruck to find it quite off the beaten track. There was very little sign of human cultivation, and we were a long way from civilization. Grossvater's map led directly to the edge of a dark woodland, almost too thick to traverse. It took some time, sitting, thinking, and smoking my pipe, listening to the curious melancholic calls of the flocks of tawny owl. At last I resolved to test the Alchyscope and see if it revealed anything, or if my growing fears that I was wasting my time were well-founded. At first, setting up the device, I considered the precise diagrams outlined by Martin. One of the pages was less of a map and more of a design. It was a kind of circle, marked by a tangent and an X crossed where the line met the circle. As I held up the page, I suddenly became convinced that the circle represented the forest's edge. Then, Looking at the line of trees, I calculated the exact point in the line of trees that Grossvater's X represented. The notion that what I was attempting was crazy did not in the least persuade me from the act. I started the engine of the Alchyscope, adjusting the mount and rotating the cylinder so that it faced directly toward the tangential line in the circle of trees. Looking through the eye hole revealed nothing unusual at first. However, experimenting with the device by decoding the various instructions on the Alchyscope diagram, the machine suddenly let forth a remarkable hum. Then a shrill, high decibel tone rang in my ears. I nervously resolved to look into the rattling Alchyscope. The incredibly sight I saw there instantly renewed my wonderment with the expedition. What a master illusionist! How had he done it? I scolded myself with confounding delight. What I saw now through the lens was for all intents a mirror of the edge of the forest. Every pike needle on each tree was unique and perfect, just as in real life. But there was one major difference: a painted green door made of wood on the edge of the forest. I glanced away from the eyepiece. Looking at the forest in real life, there was clearly nothing but foliage. Yet again, returning to the lens of the intricate golden device, that doorway remained. Mesmerized, I hastened over to the place where the door had appeared in the Alchyscope, expecting some trick to be unveiled, but as I touched the leaves I found that they were thick and solid. So the illusion in the Alchyscope was only that, a mirage created by the device. No doubt a fascinating entertainment in Grossvater's day, but little more than this. Shortly thereafter, I packed the device away. The driver had excused himself to the call of nature, so I resolved to kill a few minutes and see if I could catch sight of one of the rare species of owl. With this intent, I had began scanning along the skirting boundary of trees, trying to follow the hooting noises. At some time, I was drawn to look up at the sky, for a dark conglomerate of heavy cloud had temporarily eclipsed the sun. There ensued a chilling coldness, which caused me to shudder and hug my own arms with rising goose pimples. I abandoned the quest to see the owl and decided instead to go and sit in the carriage. Then, to my momentous surprise, as I wandered back along the forest's edge, the darkness seemed to have had some illusory effect. Or was it the light that had obscured it? Either way, that curious green doorway on the edge of the forest was now before me, clear as day. Without thinking, my hands dashed to the gold knocker. Lifting and pushing, I found the green door opened fairly easily. Therein, what I looked upon was merely a long and winding trail which ran deep into the dense forest. Readers shouldn't be surprised to find in Hergen Delamere's journal that follows the things which I have already asserted, that Hergen found the quaint town of Aufklärung beyond, and that the curious little town seemed to harbor all manner of secrets. I should skip over the rather lengthy details of his first encounter with the people and his eventually tracking down his own aunt and cousin in the local tavern. The conversations which have already been included. It would be easier to pick up the narrative here and outline what happened next. Aunt Gladys and the young boy Raphael were quite delighted to have another Delamere visiting from out of town. They were very welcoming, and after explaining how I used Grandpa Martin's Alchyscope to find the pathway in the woods, Auntie Gladys became instantly loquacious and attached to me. She bought me a very intricately decorated stein of locally brewed brown ale. The tavern was filled with 20 or so people, all drinking heavily. Aunt Gladys then began to fill me in on gossip from the local area, promising to take me on a tour after we finished our ales. The tavern was apparently once owned by the Kruger family, but was taken over by the Rakung family 15 years ago, who changed the name of the tavern to Krishna's Keep. There was a rowdy group of blonde-haired men quite drunk beside us, who Aunt Gladys explained were the Bauers and their mates, Jonathan Bauer, Heinrich Bauer, Franz Becker. These, she explained, had been close friends of her brother, Johann Delamere, before he fell off a horse and died from a fractured spine. She pointed to a few of the other locals: Chester Pfeiffer, the town's renowned and esteemed violinist, Dina Vorhind, the local chemist, and Guni Chesop, a marine biologist currently studying currents along the Rhine. After polishing another stein or two, Aunt Gladys left the young boy with the Bowers and took me on a tour of the town. As we left Krishna's Keep and came around the main street of Aufklärung, we passed a cold-looking pair of women wearing dark clothing, who Gladys scowled at, later telling me that the Schwartz sisters were new to the town, and she didn't completely trust them. She pointed out the old bell tower and the curious back streets where men toiled under electric light in privacy beneath their houses. After a long show around, to which I was extremely grateful, Aunt Gladys told me that she had better go and pick the young boy Raphael up and drop him home before it was dark, but that I should return again to visit soon. This I resolved to do, and left Aufklärung with a new lease on life, feeling quite jubilant about the whole affair, and being reacquainted with my estranged family. The sky had grown extremely dark now, though it wasn't yet dusk. Nonetheless, I found the old trail in the forest just as easily as I had done previously. The green door opened as easily as it once had, and I was happy to see that the carriage and horses were still there, with the case containing Granddad's Alchyscope still sitting on the leafy autumn dirt. Strange, though, was the disconcerting fact that my driver was nowhere to be seen. I called out several times for him, but to no avail. There was a strange track in the dirt, where the leaves had been swept away, as if someone had dragged their feet along. I followed it, hoping to find my driver, but the trail just led into the dark forest and became impossible to follow. Kneeling to examine the disturbed ground, I noticed with trepidation that there was also a trail of little droplets of red ink. I considered the possibility that the driver had been recording his own journal and spilled some ink, but something within the aspect caused me some concern. Dusk was now coming on, and I sat down to smoke my pipe and think over the situation. It would be quite rude of me to take off in the carriage without my driver, yet it was getting late, and the howls of wolves did not fill me with confidence to camp out in the dark forest. There was another hoot from one of the strange owls, which startled me and caused me to jump out of my skin. My next thought was to return to Aufklärung and ask Aunt Gladys a bed for the night. It surely wouldn't have been too imposing, given we had just rediscovered our familial bond. However, it troubled me to realize that I had only chanced on my cousin and aunt in the Krishna's Keep tavern, but didn't actually know where they lived. It was quite late to ask around, and I wouldn't have wanted to make a nuisance of myself. More time passed, and the howling of wolves grew ever more rampant. Somehow the most damning ideas came over me, and I found myself peering through Martin's notes and family tree, particularly with regards to my strange ancestor's estate, the Marquis Grafouche Delamere. I calculated that the location of his centuries-old castle, Eikot Schott, would only take a few hours to travel to. Of course, the idea was ridiculous, but the curious castle, questions of whether it still existed, and if it remained inhabited began to plague me, and I decided I must investigate the matter. So, after a short carriage ride, I dismounted and carried the Alchyscope case with me. The bushland was incredibly dense and ragged as I headed towards the castle coordinates. Passing a carcass of a massacred wolf, drained of spinal fluid, hardly filled me confidence. A white orb passed through the alleys of pine. The rays of the gibbous moon sifting thinly through the boughs, most of the ground lay in shadow. The heavy mulch of leaves crackled and squelched beneath my feet. The fiery canopy of stars had a vague malevolence. I was almost drained of energy, fearing that I had lost my way, when I knew I had reached the coordinates of the old maps. But disappointment immediately struck me. The forest came into a kind of clearing with a steep incline covered in loose stones. About 20 meters ahead, upon a raised platform of grass, there was the ruins of an old castle. At least one presumed it was. There was barely a wall in assembly. The entire knoll was covered in crumbled stone masonry. I sighed, sitting on a nearby rock and once again smoking my pipe in contemplation. Perhaps it was only by virtue of this act of repetition that the abstract thought came over me. For some reason, even though there was only limited moonlight to see, I again assembled the Alchyscope on the grass, facing towards the ruin of the old castle. I caught shot. First, checking through the aperture, as was to expected, what I saw was the exact same thing as was there in real life, a crumbled pile of gray slabs of stone. Not perturbed by the strange cracking sounds of nature and eerie wind, I carried out a similar procedure as I had last time. Firing up the engine and altering the dials, I soon ramped up the power of the Alchyscope until it was rattling and whistling loudly. Preparing myself, I now bent over and peered through the strange gold device. What I saw defied all cognitive claims to rationality, sending insane trickles through my warping mind. The illusions brought on by the Alchyscope were at their most intense within the Black Forest. Everything beyond the lens differed slightly from what was accepted as the reality it overlaid. The spectrum of colors was noticeably different. For one, it seemed as though it wasn't nighttime at all through the device. Darkness showed up as a multi-layered color beyond the regular ultraviolet spectrum. The particles of the air were also not remotely still, but the air swiveled as though everything was underwater, and strange semi-translucent life forms seemed to swim rapidly through the sky. The rubble of bricks was no longer laid out, but there stood an immense castle of burnt brick covered in unnatural flame. Everything around the burning castle flickered as though it was the center of a black hole. Strange shapes slinked around the peripheries of my vision, making me glance up occasionally, only to confirm that the reality I had looked upon still differed vastly from the illusion in the Alchyscope. Suddenly, something occurred to me by the way the light was bouncing off a certain area behind the Fleming Castle. Looking up, I saw that even in the moonlight, the strange area beyond the knoll, an unnatural light seemed to flicker. Leaving the Alchyscope for a moment, I walked past the castle ruins and approached the strange area. The closer I got to it, the more I became convinced something was not quite right. The forest on the other side of the knoll seemed a little distant and wobbly, as though obscured by a glass wall. As my hands finally reached the surface, this indeed seemed to be the case. What I touched was solid and cold. Extending in a kind of spherical curve, it seemed to mark the beginning of an immense glass dome. I pressed my face against the cold glass, marveling at the opaque illusion within. The castle behind me was reflected in the glass, but more than this, the entire hill beyond seemed to be a mirror image of what was behind. But not exactly the same, for the bricks seemed half as demolished as the true castle. Standing about half its full height, the castle through the glass was only partially decayed. I looked behind to confirm I was not going mad. Sure enough, I could count the number of bricks, differing significantly the castle beyond the glass dome. As I felt around the cold glass to see how long it extended, something else occurred to me. Behind the ruins off the castle, the glass wall met another corner. There appeared to be an adjacent dome of glass, extending in the opposite direction. The reflection in the second dome also reflected the knoll on which the ruins of Castle Ecotshot had once stood. But this time, as I pressed my face against the glass dome, I found the space was occupied by more than mere apparitions. Groups of soldiers began to become apparent through the glass. Yet, these soldiers were not like any I had seen, certainly not Prussian, nor French, nor English, nor Russian. Their boots and coats seemed to be of a finely cut, shiny material. They wore flat, circular hats and had distinctive decorative flags on their sleeves, depicting a four-pronged rune in red, white, and black. The soldiers were marching around the castle ruins as if guarding or patrolling the area. Rapidly, I moved back towards the first glass dome, desiring to compare the illusions, but within, I saw no such vision of futuristic soldiers. What I did see was a man in a brown robe and a pointed hood. I was instantly reminded of folklore surrounding the Ruprecht, a devil who dressed as such, but so far none of the other characteristics confirmed any other link than his cloak. He was not limping or carrying a staff, nor did he hold a bag of ashes, nor did he have little bells on his clothes, nor did he ride a white horse, nor was he accompanied by fairies or men with blackened faces, or men dressed as women. I watched the curious robed man through the glass of the first dome, marveling as he began to walk, yet seemed intrinsically aware of my presence. He walked behind the side of the castle, approaching something. It took me some time to recognize what he was doing, and it was only when the robed man began to walk forward, carrying the gold object, that I realized with terror and astonishment that he was carrying the Alchyscope. With utter fright, I turned around, expecting to see the robed man behind me. But instead, my fear was only further accelerated when I saw no man, but no Alchyscope either. The thing had vanished from where it had sat on the grassy patch back near the forest edges. I rushed back to the first dome, gazing through and seeing that Granddad's Alchyscope sat mockingly at the front of the knoll, just before the glass out of reach. The robed man was walking back around out of view behind the castle now. Impatient and thinking of the curious soldiers inside the second dome, I rushed to see what was happening in the second space. Even as I walked towards, I could see that nothing was still beyond the second dome. An apocalypse of color and sound seemed to be happening. The flaming ruins of the castle seemed to be repairing before my eyes. But the rest of the landscape had become the image of Armageddon. The purple sky was filled with hideous black beasts flapping on bats' wings. Meteors showered, and giant reptiles strolled through German valleys and over mountains. The metamorphosis was enough to send me completely insane, so much so that I could no longer look upon it. Turning from the glass domes, I decided to get out of the Black Forest as fast as possible and get the hell back to civilization. Imagine my abysmal terror as I descended down the grassy knoll and came to the point where I had entered the forest, only to find my head bashed against a cold surface. Feeling about, I found that the place that I had come into the castle knoll was no longer an open space. A similar domed surface of glass had covered it. But where the other curved domes had been convex, this concave surface indicated that I had myself somehow been encased within a third glass dome, meeting the boundaries of the other two adjacent domes. Hugging the glass surface, I turned to look back at the castle. I was relieved to see that at least the ruins on the knoll in front of me remained the same as when I had first come across it. Terror overtook me, and I had to think fast. I walked slowly towards the castle, considering the image of the standing black castle I had seen through the glass dome. I worked out where the rough entrance would be amidst the rubble, walking through the 2 pillars of stone that would have once marked the doorway. As I did so, my eyes still caught frightful imagery through the apocalyptic second dome. There seemed to be some monstrous dead alien laid out across the hillside, its long tubular appendages, conical headband, carrot-like segments, and feelers gave it a frightfully unearthly appearance. I didn't half believe I saw other horrid reptilian-looking figures skulking around, as if trying to find some passage inside the dome I was within. I stepped further inside the ruined castle, noticing a higher portion of stone, undamaged towards the back. There was a bronze seal marked on the stone wall. The picture on the seal had the appearance of an engraved owl. Turning back towards the grass, my eyes saw a sight which filled me with a slither of hope. Somehow, defying all logic, the Alchyscope was back on the slopes of the grassy knoll where I had originally set it down. If I could only get the Alchyscope back, I thought, I might be able to find a way out of this trap. I raced forward, but as I came back out of the castle entrance, an unnerving truth awaited me. It was still nighttime, but the air was no longer merely lit by moonlight. A surreal, otherworldly color stuttered and swam about the air. There was a luminance of uncanny stature. As I approached and picked up the gold device, I made the terrible mistake of looking beyond the glass dome. What I saw there utterly disabled my senses. I no longer looked out upon the Black Forest of Germany. Instead, there yawned a vast abyss of bulbous globes, as though I was inside the mind of a giant fly, looking into infinite different dimensions. Within each bulb, fractured realities and insect-like things which defied description looked in upon me as though they were voyeurs to our reality. The vision was so blinding I couldn't stare for more than a few seconds. Stumbling back into the castle, which I fretfully perceived was slightly less dismantled than it had been, I came into a more constructed black hall, darker and enclosed with stone. Then I glanced down an adjacent stone corridor. Amazed to see the depthless corridor went on for some measure, I was bewildered to find myself entering a stone labyrinth of a kind. Clinging to the edges of the walls, my hand brushing stone. My heart began to race in my chest, palpitating wildly. Stumbling in the dark, I was horrified when a cold, clammy hand with sharp claws grabbed my arm. I couldn't see a thing, but thrust my arm up, knocking the inhuman thing backwards. It grunted with unnatural fervor. Not waiting, I continued to rush through the stone labyrinth. At last, my eyes caught salvation in a moonlit plateau, the light at the end of the tunnel. Rushing back out of the castle gates, I was relieved to find myself back on the original knoll, within the Black Forest. Pure relief lifted within my heart to find no glass barrier. I wasted no time to haul my Alchyscope back through the dark forest, running through the bushes with passion, never looking back. As a psychologist at Berkeley Institution, I have seen my share of complicated delusional frameworks, and it is quite possible that Mr. Delamere was suffering from a strong case of schizophrenia long before that condition was properly understood. This would at least explain his obsessive quest to follow up on what most would discount as pure folly. Ergen lived a relatively peaceful life after these incidents, living for another 11 years before suffering a heart attack. He does relate other attempts to return to the town of Aufklärung over the ensuing few years. However, he claims that he never again successfully found the hidden green doorway in the woods by using the Alchyscope, which he seemed to believe was damaged during his flight from the castle. Of the incident he described in the Black Forest, Mr. Delamere gives little insight, except to speculate on what he believes he had seen. In his latter years, Ergen becomes particularly fixated in his journals on the hand which he thinks touched him in the darkness of Castle Ikot Shot. That the thing was not human, he asserts with certainty. On some days he seems to convince himself that what he had seen was some mutated apparition of his great lost ancestor, the Marquis of Isho Shot. But even Delamere confesses that the notion is too absurd to entertain. He eventually abandons all faith in his experiences, doubting his own senses, suggesting that he must have been the victim of extreme hallucinations caused by an overload of stress. This would certainly confirm my theory that Ergen was himself sadly suffering from mental illnesses, long before society understood how to treat such maladies. In any case, the story remains a fairly interesting one, and the folklore certainly has a unique flavor. I don't know what compels me to compile this case file, but I suppose one cannot deny their own interests. The diaries and maps mentioned in the journals would certainly be an interesting aspect of study. I would have loved to have seen them, but according to police documents alongside autopsy reports, Ergen set all of his paperwork and the strange Alchyscope on fire before his fatal heart attack. I suppose there shall never be any way to conclusively invalidate or confer authenticity of his bizarre accounts. But this would be a fine point to put the lid on my own account. Dr. Simon Kearns, psychologist at Berkeley Institution,